Hello and welcome to Sojern's webinar today. What we learned in 2020 and how it will affect 2021 travel. Today we will take a deep dive into the travel insights of 2020 as it was affected by the pandemic, and we will then share our insights on what we see moving forward into 2021. I'm Grant Palmer. I'm the VP of Sales at Sojern, and I look forward to this presentation today. I'm super excited about the agenda that we have moving forward. In the agenda, we will take a look in depth at 2020 global travel trends, both search and booking trends. We will we have a partner in PlaceIQ who will take a deeper dive into what's happening with feet on the ground in travel globally. We have two fantastic presenters with us today. We have Drew Brunig, and who's the EVP of Strategy at PlaceIQ, and Jessica Cook, who is the lead data analyst of Travel Insights here at Sojern. I also want to mention that we're going to have a Q&A after the presentation, so please make sure to enter your questions here on the right as we go through the presentation. And if you cannot stay for the full presentation, we are recording this, and what we'll do is we'll send it out via email, and you can watch it at a later time if you're unable to stay for the full time. Okay. So you want to could we click to the next slide, please? First, before we dive into this, I want to give a little bit of a deep dive into Sojern. Sojern is a first-party data travel platform, and we collect first-party travel data in real time, search and booking data, and we utilize that data for insights for both targeting and creation of audiences and insights, which you will see here today. Click to the next slide, please. We take that, we take our data, we look at travel intent data that we have, and we utilize that data for search and booking and intent data. We build the audiences, determine what the demand is, and then we work with marketers to then drive the marketing programs and insights for marketing campaigns for travel companies worldwide. And I wanted to mention that I'm remiss that I'd like to also introduce our two presenters and allow them to introduce themselves. First, Drew, would you mind introducing yourself and talking a little bit about PlaceIQ? You're on mute.
Sure. My name is Drew Brunig. I'm President of Strategy here at PlaceIQ. I lead our data science and reporting teams and have been working in this space for nearly a decade. So we at PlaceIQ look at where people go using mobile phones. So we see opted-in devices moving throughout the United States, and we can use that to deduce where people live, where people visit, and where people travel to, in addition to other behaviors that we see. Today I'll be walking you some of the data that we see, how that connects to the story that's being woven by Grant and Jessica, and how we can use that to kind of get an even kind of richer view of the traveler during social distancing.
Super, thanks, Drew. Jessica, mind introducing yourself as well?
Thanks, Grant. And nice to have you here today with us, Drew. My name is Jessica. I'm on the Insights team here at Sojern, and what we do as a team is use Sojern's data that we collect across all of our websites and data partners that we have to understand traveler behavior to help our clients meet our customers where they are in their journey.
Great, thank you very much, Jessica. Okay, so again, please, we have some questions that have been introduced to us prior to the presentation. Please enter any questions that you may have throughout, and we'll do our best to answer all of the questions at the end of this in the Q&A section. Jessica, I'm going to now hand it over to you.
Thanks, Grant. And hello, everyone. At first, we'll be going over a bit of some of the trends in 2020, where we ended the year, and then go into some slides looking forward into 2021 travel. So starting off, some of the trends that we noticed changing in 2020 due to COVID. The one that I'm highlighting on this slide is the shift to remote and rural being a transition, those areas becoming more popular for travelers. So what we see on the slide is US metros. Some of the biggest metros are popping out in dark red, meaning they're showing year-over-year strong decline. We are looking at January 2021 versus 2020, but this trend has held true if you look for a wider range going back to May, June of last year. So you have, your Seattles, your Bay Areas, Chicago's, New York's, and Washington's, all showing declines still. Due to the pandemic, obviously that's something we want to watch. And in the center of the country, you see some smaller, generally lower volume areas popping out as showing year-over-year growth. So, Rapid Falls, Dakota, Omaha, Nebraska, Billings, Montana, as being particularly attractive during COVID. I'll also want to draw your eye down to Florida. That's Panama City down in Florida, also showing year-over-year growth. And Florida metros are a bit of a mixed bag. Even the larger metros, Tampa and Miami, are not as deep red as many other larger metros that we're seeing around the US. So in addition to the shift to remote, we're also seeing that, during COVID, we've talked a lot about travelers are opting to stay close at home. There's a large domestic rebound. People physically cannot go anywhere they want due to international border closures. There's been uneven recovery with a lot of stops and starts as entire economies in the US states close down and tighten restrictions and then relax. We've seen travelers plan longer trips with shorter planning windows. So moving into that first observation of travelers staying close to home, really looking at travel distance. And all of my slides are going to be focused on the global market. So realize that it is very high level. We're trying to capture a lot of areas. And there are obviously nuances happening in the regions and for specific countries. And Insights has reporting that we can definitely send out that are more destination specific. But overall, the global market, looking at hotel booking around the world, domestic travel is continuing to recover faster than regional and international travel. So look at that light green line, the domestic, that really improved greatly coming out of the, I would say, the pause or the reset that first week of April, right? Jumped up, had a good, strong summer. The decline in fall is seasonal, a bit stronger in 2019 or 2020 than we saw in 2019, but has seen some nice uptick in 2021. Some countries that are doing particularly well in their domestic tourism, APAC countries kind of fell to the top or are rising to the top. South Korea, Thailand, Australia is near their 2020 volumes. The UAE is still a lockdown, so the countries there, even domestically, are not as high as we're seeing in APAC, but United Arab Emirates was a big standout, showing positive growth. And LATAM, Costa Rica, positive growth, Puerto Rico, nearly there. The key call out here is within the domestic market, what continues to be the biggest year-over-year change, meaning more people are staying in 2020 than 2019. And it's that super close bucket of 0 to 100 miles. And we see that consistently no matter the region. So it's still showing that people are a bit cautious about expanding that bubble and exploring further out. And it's definitely something we will be watching as we move forward into 2021. Now, if we compare the lodging and our flight markets and how those two are performing, and again, this should be no surprise to everyone on this call, but our lodging market is doing better because people are staying closer, more people are driving, and fewer people are flying. So the domestic hotel booking versus domestic flight booking is actually recovered about over 50%. So you see we're 40% down from where we were a year ago. Versus in 2019, we would expect to be 7% up growth if we had the same level of performance that we did in 2019. Versus flight is nearly 60% still down. The other thing I'll note on this slide is I wanted to point out the holidays, how holidays show up in our booking data. And you see the red line, that is Christmas in both of the charts. And being an international holiday, that impacts our data more strongly than national holidays, which are two US holidays, 4th of July and Thanksgiving, there in the gray. Switching to a daily view now, because there's some nuances I wanted to pick up that are kind of hidden at the weekly level. We see here, now it's strictly by year. 2019 is in light blue, 2020 in dark blue, and 2021 in that orange. So the first thing we notice is the orange is looking really nice, sloping up. That's exactly what we want to see. We hope it continues. Moving on into 2019 levels, but so far in 2021, I would say the recovery is looking pretty strong and good. The gray line that I'm noting, the week of October 3rd, is there to show that the behavior in 2020 aligned with 2019, meaning I would say that would be the end of summer bookings. And after that point in both years, the bookings tapered off for the remainder of the year. Now, this is not when people are traveling, this is when people are booking, and people tend to stop or slow down their booking beyond that point, and we saw that across both years. Now, there's also something interesting going on for the daily view. Now, if you look to the light blue, you see that the bars, there's a very wide variance between Saturday and Sunday that are down there at the bottom, and then it pops up on Monday, followed by Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And that pattern continues consistently throughout the year. When we shift to looking at 2020, we see that those bars are closer together, meaning that in 2020, more people proportionally are booking on weekends, meaning that fewer people are booking on the weekdays. So what's going on? Well, I think largely it comes to people being around computers during the weekends. And why is that? Well, more of us are working from home. We have good setups now, internet, good computer. So we have, I think there's a portion of the population that have a lot more access to computers on the weekends and may also be working on the weekends. And in addition to people not moving about as much still. So if you're at home, you're more likely to be on that computer. And if you're on that computer, you may as well book that trip that you're thinking about, and it doesn't have to wait till Monday when you remember because you're sitting down in front of your computer again. So switching to a regional view, looking at how the different regions have performed, again, for our hotel booking, our hotel vertical. And we see that the US in dark blue was the region that was impacted the least, meaning it fell the least down to the bottom, which was the week of April 5th. It recovered fastest in summer, had a relatively strong summer, declined for fall, and is now showing upward movement in 2021, which is great to see. EMEA, on the other hand, look at the green line. Now, EMEA fell a bit further than the US at the lowest point of the market. It did have a strong recovery in the summer, but early in the summer, mid-June, July timeframe was when countries started to shut down. So it kind of flattened, fell to an early start to their fall, and overall has remained down as many of those countries remain in lockdown. Two other regions I'll point out, the Caribbean, and I did want to make this all hotel booking to make sure we pulled in Caribbean to show them they don't have a lot of domestic movement, as you can imagine, and LATAM. Now, very different. Those two regions started recovery a little later. COVID came to those regions a bit later. They remained in lockdown. LATAM also struggling with very high COVID cases. So in Caribbean, you see that it took a little while for them to start, and they've been kind of slowly recovering up. That continues in 2021. LATAM had a very strong fall, I would say, peaked and has had a bit of a correction since then. You can see that the countries I've pointed out as being performing particularly well since the beginning of when this data is showing, January 5th, 2020. For instance, the Maldives has shown growth. They're particularly attractive and have open borders for foreign tourists. Russia is a highlight in EMEA, again, looser restrictions in terms of travel. And in the US, the states that are doing particularly well, we're no longer showing Canada as those places haven't, their high growth was mostly in the summer, and we haven't seen that come back so far early in the year. But the states that are doing well in the US are the states that we kind of highlighted a few slides ago, the South Dakotas, Montanas, Nebraska, Idahos. Those areas that are more remote and rural are continuing to be attractive to travelers. So switching to looking a bit forward, what can we see about when people are departing? And what we're seeing is that travelers are still being cautious, meaning their traveling planning is still very short, shorter than prior year. So looking at all of the bookings that were made in the month of January, we see that the orange columns there, meaning 2021, across each region are higher than previous year. So people searching in January to depart in January, more people are doing that across every region than what we saw last year. And they're pulling volume from every category: spring, summer, and fall travel. Now, there are a few exceptions where we're seeing bookings for summer specifically, so in that May, June, July section, and I wanted to call those out. In APAC, we're seeing people already booked to go to the Maldives and Singapore. EMEA had quite a few countries actually where travelers are booking in higher proportions for summer than prior year, potentially because they're not traveling right now, but they're feeling comfortable enough to make travel for a couple months out. So people are looking to go to Cyprus, Ireland, Poland, and Spain. And then in the US, really the only state where I'm seeing a strong bump for summer so far is Maine. And looking similar view, but lead times by week. I like this chart because I can get a pulse point on the kind of the latest changes, whereas the previous slide was more of a snapshot view. And what I'm seeing from this slide, if you compare the prior year, and this is a rolling period to get 2020 and 2021 kind of side by side down at the bottom, is we're starting to see that lead times are increasing in the 3-month category in line with seasonal trends. So what I'm looking for or looking at is the dark blue line in both of the charts, and we see that bump early in the 2020 year for when COVID hit. People immediately turned to long-term planning, thinking this is going to be over in a few months. Went ahead and made those bookings. That quickly tapered off, and people remained very short-term planners throughout the rest of the year into the holiday season. Now around Christmas, you see that dark blue line is popping up again. And then if you look immediately up to the prior year, you see that the 3-month category, people become longer term planners in the beginning of the year in a typical year. So why do we care about lead times? And I think that lengthening lead times are positive news because it shows that travelers are confident in traveling. You know, if you're willing to make a trip 3 months out, you know, it says something about you think the place is going to be open, you think the situation will still be relatively, you know, manageable. So it shows confidence in the market and where we are with the rollout of, you know, say the vaccines and getting COVID under control. Audience composition may also be changing. So as people get confident in the market that we are coming out of this situation, more people who are have a lower risk tolerance, maybe also considering to travel when things are more calm. And the other thing longer lead times allow for is additional trip complexity. So if you book your trip 3 months out, you have a lot of time. If you book your flight first, typically, you have more time to look for that hotel. If you book your hotel, then you have more time to look for your attraction and other things to do while on site. So what this allows our advertisers to do is it gives them more time to get in front of people that they know are going to their destination. And finally, I wanted to show something that the Insights team has been working on, very, very new. And it's a forecasting model to help our clients understand where demand might be different this year versus 2019, which is our last kind of normal year, right? The intention of this is not to say you will have 5,000 or 50,000 or whatever people visiting. It's to show where the demand, we're seeing changes. So it's really helping our destinations adjust their strategy as we see the market changing. So the example is showing 4 countries going to Japan. We're showing 2 countries from APAC, China and Singapore in orange, and 2 countries from Europe, France and United Kingdom. Now, Singapore in both 2019 and what we are seeing in the straight line and projecting all of those the rest of the line through the rest of the year, that Singapore has the highest volume proportionally out of all 4 of the countries. But really where you see the difference happening is the 2nd and 3rd place, which in 2019, that's China in the bright orange line. And in 2021, we're projecting that the UK surpasses China in terms of the UK wanting, and this is intent data, this is search data, wanting to visit Japan more than China. And the reason we're thinking that's going to flip is because vaccinations in the UK are much faster than China. So we predict that people will be more willing to travel. People in the UK will be more willing to travel than China. Now, this does kind of ignore the destination, and I think there's something to be said for if cases are low in China, which is something we accommodate for in the model, but if cases are low in the origin and the destination, then there might be easier or fewer travel restrictions from the destination to allow those origins with lower COVID cases into the country. So that's one of the things we're going to be looking for to bake into this model going forward is these travel restrictions, maybe GDP of the origin country, like how easy is it essentially to travel, and then unemployment rate are some factors we're considering. But again, this tool we're hoping allows our customers to better understand how demand is changing, given that 2020 was such an odd year for us. So that is what I had to share from my slides. I'm going to turn it over to Drew, and then both he and I will join you at the end of the show for some Q&A. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jessica. So that we see a lot of the same trends that Jessica's seen in terms of staying closer to home, being a little more cautious, and kind of shorter travel plans as well. So let's kind of look at 2020 in hindsight that we see through our data and kind of the story that it tells us. So what you're looking at here is you're looking at 2020, and what we're showing you is what our year-over-year index. So we are comparing the foot traffic, which is devices we see visiting a venue or category of venues, in this case here, and we compare it to 2019. So that black dotted line in the middle is normal, or at least is 2019 normal. So if you're above the line, traffic is up year over year. If you're below the line, traffic is down year over year. Now, to situate yourself with this graph, it's important not to just use the year over year as the benchmark, but also to use another thing that I've included here, which is also going to come in handy when we start looking at some other travel behaviors. But look at the top line, the gas stations line. That's that top purple line. And as you can see, it tells a pretty mild story, all things considered. It was going along pretty well. Then it hits mid-April, mid-March. On March 10th, that was the day that the NBA suspended its season. And Tom and Rita Hanks, conveniently at the same day, announced that they were recouping from COVID in an Australian hospital. Those two events kind of set off the collective kind of panic and prepare phase for the US. Everybody ran out to grocery stores, big box stores, pharmacies, liquor stores, everything they would need to get through essentially a month of quarantine. And you can see that with gas stations really quickly. You see a brief spike, and then it goes straight down, drops about 25% of traffic, and it stays there for about 3 weeks. After 3 weeks, when we hit Easter, people started to kind of say, hey, I want to, see what's still around. We can't quarantine forever. I want to, create some semblance of an Easter dinner for my family. And you start to see people starting to come back after that 3-week period. And we entered what was basically a 2-month phase of reestablishing traffic and reestablishing it at some normal levels. And most categories, so retail, dining, at least not casual dining, but takeout dining, and a lot of other categories basically came back to, I would say, 80% or above of normal levels after 2 months of recovery. You can see gas stations having that 2 months of recovery. They kind of tap that dotted black line, and then they hover around 95% for the rest of the year. Now, that was what we saw in retail, but as you can imagine, travel as a sector was a little slower to come back. And when they came back, it wasn't at 80% of levels, it was a little lower than that. So we have several lines down here below. One of the relative bright spots in the travel sector was budget hotels. So motels actually had a really good year, oddly, well, good year relatively. The fact that they were a little cheaper and people were looking to stay a little bit more value-centric this year. The fact that they were along road trip destinations and nature and outdoors venues, because people weren't traveling to cities because the events weren't on, the restaurants weren't open. Why would you do that? Let's just go out to the great outdoors where everything we would normally do is still open. So budget hotels like, Travelodge, Motel 6, others did really well. And they did even especially well if you looked at the venues that were near kind of nature destinations. Those traffic patterns were at 100% of normal, if not higher. But as you can see, they recovered over about 4 months to about 90% of norm, which is pretty good. Also, the other thing is business travel has basically been missing in action during this. Though some forms of kind of blue collar business travel, more like agriculture, transit and other things, those have been doing well, and those tend to stick around budget motels as well. So those budget motels, that green line, is kind of the high bar for travel. Car rental, little below that. Then we get into all hotels, that orange line, which kind of gives you the benchmark. Now, if you go down into luxury hotels, which is that the line right below the orange, I know there's two kind of dark purple lines, but luxury hotels have been, pinched pretty hard, as Jessica kind of went over. We see it coming down at about 50% to 60% of traffic, never really going too much above it, though we do start to see some signs of life. Now, at the end of the chart, you can see it starting to dip down. The reason that's dipping down is because it's a year-over-year metric. And normally in December, you'd start to see those hotels picking back up as holiday travel picks up. But it didn't pick up at the same pace. It picked up a little. So if you were looking at just traffic lines, you would see it going up. But year-over-year, it did not. But down at the bottom, I think, are some of the kind of what I would say is the second degree effects. The big one here is public transit, which I just kind of include to show, it's still very, very down. I use public transit as kind of an indicator of how active cities are for a lot of reasons. And because one of the reasons that cities are so hit is not just because of tourism, which is a big one, but also commuters. There's a lot of stories. There's another story going around today about how people are moving away from cities. That definitely is happening, but it's a small effect. It's like 1% of the cities. Much more important is the fact that you have a complete base of commuters and travelers that are not coming to the cities. And in many cities, that accounts for maybe 40%, 60% of the traffic that you see during a weekday. And that's just gone. So this is this kind of COVID shock, quarantine, and then the beginning of a recovery around Easter. Travel took a little longer to recover. As you can see, it really kind of hit its kind of normal, like found a new normal in the beginning of September. But we're starting to see some predictability and flattening of these things as we go through. So let's look at some of the profiles of the people who are traveling, starting with the heavy travelers. So heavy travelers we define as people who we see frequently at airports and hotels. And what we did is we kind of looked at those people and we looked at what heavy travelers in 2019 looked like, what were their demographic qualities, what were their origins, their states, and how do they compare to 2020? So basically what behaviors gained a lot or lost a lot. And we found some surprising results. So one of the things we did see is that states with a little bit less regulation, like Florida or Texas, definitely attracted more travelers, South Dakota being another one. One, because they tended to align with nature and outdoors recreation as well. But two, one of the things that we tended to see is that regulations tended to, for most industries, so dining, retail, other things, regulations were a lagging indicator. By the time a city or a county or a state came out and said, hey, indoor dining is canceled, most of that population had already stopped indoor dining. We saw that time and time again. The population of those locales, most of it, 80 to 90% of them, would react before the regulations came, leaving only that 10% to be driven inside by the regulation. Now in travel, that was pretty different. The reason it's different is because if you have a destination, like say you have a beach community that everyone wants to visit in Florida, you're going to take that 10% of people who basically have higher risk or higher risk tolerances that are all going to head. So the regulations on a local level tend to follow the behaviors of the populace. But when it comes to travel, the regulations tend to matter a lot more. And we're seeing that here, both in destinations, but also in who's the most likely to travel. So if you look at the share of travelers we saw in 2020, normally you would see Florida slightly less than making up 11% of travelers. It actually gained 3% of the total share, which is massive. That's a huge gain. Texas, Arizona, Tennessee, and Nevada. So we see a lot coming through the Sun Belt of a lot more movement. Now, the bottom originating states, the states that lost the greatest percent of their share, not that surprising. We basically see it over in the urban kind of Northeast or California on the coast. So again, it's following a very similar trajectory of basically the governments are kind of a reflection of what the people are doing as well. So this is kind of a good reminder, is sometimes you do see kind of a great reshuffling, as a lot more restrictions come to California, you might see people reshuffle to Texas and vice versa. And what happens is that the people who are reshuffling to Texas are the people who are the most risk, have the highest risk tolerance. Whereas within California, that government reflects the will of most of that people, and we can see that in the travel. They're kind of the least likely to travel and had the most the biggest decline. But let's look at the qualities of these heavy travelers. There's a couple themes that come out. First off, even though people who make over 150,000 a year in household income still represent the lion's share of heavy travelers, 60%, which makes sense. They've got to afford those airline tickets and those hotels that they're visiting. We saw the greatest gains in the 50 to 100K household income. And that affluent range actually dropped by 13%. This was quite significant. Second, we saw that if you had no children in home, so you were a single or just a dual household, you saw gains in traffic. Whereas if you're 3, 4, 5, and this is even more important in multi-generational homes where you might have someone who is above 65, like a grandparent living with you, who basically makes the entire house a lot more risk averse. We saw drops as the households got bigger, gains as the households were smaller. Again, makes sense. You have a little more freedom because you aren't also taking care of children and or trying to stay cautious for the older people in your household. And then secondarily, we saw people with lower incomes more likely to gain in travel. This actually was a reflected an observation we had made earlier, which is the people who make more money were more likely to actively quarantine and shelter at home. Now, there's two reasons for this. The first is you generally have a more comfortable home and more space. You can kind of hang out in your backyard and do other things. If you are in a small apartment with a medium-sized family, you're going to be moving around just out of necessity. The second reason, which we validated with our data, but also we work with the research departments at the economics departments of Penn, Yale, and the University of British Columbia. They validated it as well with their own research that the higher income means you're way more likely to be working from home. So if you have a higher income, you're more likely to be working from home. And one of the things we see, and if you want to go to the next slide, we can validate this again, is that people who are essential workers or going out and taking risks in their professional life, either because they have to or because they seek that out, tend to take similar risks in their private life as well, which I can definitely relate to. If I had to go and kind of take risks all week, I sure as hell am going to be doing that on the weekend. Can you skip the next slide? So we see that reflected in the income. We also see that in the education level attained. People who only attained high school degrees are plus nearly 10% more likely to travel compared to last year. Whereas if you obtained a bachelor's degree, you're down 6%. Graduate degree, actually about flat. Then if we look at the employment, the more white collar you are, the less likely you are to travel in general. Blue collar is way up. Again, reflecting what we're seeing in some of our other research, which is you're more likely to take more risks. And when I say risks, I'm saying leaving the house and other things. We don't know what you're doing in terms of mask wearing and all that other stuff. But in terms of house and activity, you're more likely to do those things if you're already having to take those risks in your professional life as well. So we see a lot more traveler coming from a slightly lower income bracket and more likely from the blue collar ranges. And that's affecting the heavy traveler base. But like I said, the lion's share is still being made. Oh, we covered that right there. Perfect. But the important thing here to note is don't overweight these changes. So as I said, it's slightly less income is gaining in the heavy traveler segment, but still 60% of the heavy travelers we see make over 150K. So you still see that lion's share in the changes. What we do see is just a little bit of skewing where we see less office workers, less income, and less kids playing a driving decision in kind of the opportunity for travel. So adjust those kind of targets just slightly and maybe see that as an opportunity to go after some kind of new unclaimed traveler segment that you may not have considered in the past. Now, for the non-heavy travelers, this is a much more kind of what I would say universal and impactful shift in how people travel in America. So let's talk about travelers and talk about the new types of vacations they're taking. So Jessica covered a lot of the international and other travel from airlines. I want to talk about road trips because road trips were one of the dominant forms of travel this year, and it gained massively. In general, we saw that vacations are taking place closer to home, as Jessica said, but they also look like home too. So using our visitation data, we can determine if someone is visiting a venue, meaning it's someplace that they don't usually reside. And we look at the activities that they do there, and we can compare to those vacation activities and visitation to what they were doing in 2019. And what we found is that when they're in travel mode now, they're visiting what I would call everyday things a lot more. Instead of going to fancy restaurants, they're going to the grocery store and bringing it back to their Airbnb or their hotel with a kitchenette to cook at their hotel. In our qualitative and quantitative research, basically travel looks a whole lot more like home than it ever did. It's kind of a home away from home trip. And part of the reason for this is because of working from home, the ability and flexible working arrangements, and two, distance learning. So that allowed summer travel to actually extend a little bit more into October and September than it usually does. And we see what we are seeing is we are seeing vacations where people cook in different kitchens. So basically they're not going out to eat. They are taking Zoom calls from different couches, but still doing that just at home and at vacation. And the third thing that I think is really interesting is like nature and outdoors continues to soar. That's the default mode of travel for many people, as Jessica covered when we looked at the destinations. Entertainment venues, hotels, some of these were our worst performing categories year over year, like museums, theme parks, other things like that. Those are being abstained from, and we're seeing these outdoor activities become the new default. So if you want to go to the next slide, let me bring this to life even a little bit more. So the other thing that we see with road trips is that vacations are staying way closer to home. So we took a slice at just one period. We were looking at 4th of July weekend, and we were looking at how far people were traveling from their homes at the height of the summer travel season. They had a 3-day weekend. Some were extending it longer into that week. And what we found is that 30% less devices traveled beyond 500 miles. But within that road trip range, we're seeing lots more short behavior and especially super short behavior, like less than 50 miles. Travelers were more likely to stay close to home. 20% more devices took trips within 50 miles. So seeing a lot of cabin communities, going to lake houses, going to beach houses, going to, just slight change of pace. Let's have a change of scenery. Let's go someplace close by and do everything that we normally do, just in a slightly different place. So let's go to the next slide. So you can see this distance travel for activities as well. So what you're looking at here is not, the y-axis here is not visitation, but it's the average distance someone is traveling from their home to visit a venue. So if you look at it, it goes from 0 miles all the way up to 180 miles. And we have these phases that we're charting, but these bottom is the week numbers, and we have these 3 phases. Panic and prepare is those phases in March where traffic just dropped to nothing. Quarantine routine is those 3 weeks when everything was just at the floor. So you can see basically not only did traffic drop to all these venues during the panic and prepare and quarantine routine, but the amount of the traffic that did remain was super close to home. People cut down all of their kind of distance travel during the quarantine routine. And so we saw that as kind of a lagging indicator of traffic. As traffic started to come back during the reemergence ramp, we started to see people venturing out more. And what was notable were the things that they were venturing out to. That being notably nature and outdoors. We started to see more and more traffic to nature and outdoors. What's interesting is that the traffic spiked immediately. And then as people got kind of bored of their local nature and outdoors area, they started to develop a taste for it and going further and further away for novelty. You see it going from in week 19 and 20, where the average distance traveled to a park is maybe 20 miles for a hike or some recreation activity. But while that traffic is staying flat, suddenly the distance travel is getting a lot higher as people are seeking out novelty. And that's why we're starting to see a lot more outdoor-based travel. And then let's go to the next slide. And then this is back to a year-over-year traffic basis, so it's not distance traveled. And I include this just to show you kind of the dramatic difference in what travel looks like this year, which is we're seeing a skyrocketing of travel to beaches, which is that dark purple line that's up 40% at many points year over year. Campgrounds stay at basically 100%. Why? Because they're reservation based. So we just see them full up and stay full for longer than they usually do. Really amazing. But then the traditional things like Legoland, which opened much earlier than Disney World, it opened in early June, and we start to see a little bit of that prep and then coming back, and then Disney World starting to just start to open up at the end of July. So again, the normal activities are off the table, and what's on the table is the great outdoors. So we have that kind of road trip, home away from home, new travel that becomes the norm now. So next slide. So how do you use this data to kind of reach travelers? The most important thing that we find for clients is that you need to meet people at the risks they're willing to take. If you are spending lots of money trying to get people to leave their home when they don't want to, because they have many good reasons not to. It could be that they live with older grandparents and they don't want to expose them. It could be that they're healthcare workers and they finding it hard to take time off these days. It could be that they are immunocompromised for whatever reason. They may be sheltering in place a lot more strictly than others. One of the first things we advise people in campaigns, again, is meet people to where their risk is. So we can actually look at activities for each household and start to divide them up into, are they still strictly isolating? We basically are comparing their current level of activities to what they were doing pre-COVID. And so we can say, are they still strictly isolating? If they are, don't talk to them about travel right now, or at least don't try to get them to plan trips that are going to be right around the corner. Start talking to them about trips maybe several months out. When it comes to the other end of the spectrum, which is the people who are out and about doing things almost exactly like they did pre-COVID, these are the guys you want to talk to first. You're not going to have to do a lot of convincing to get them to leave the house. They're already doing it on their own. So you've kind of have half of your work already solved for you. So segmenting your audiences based on risk is one of the most important things you can do. And using this data to both find the locations where these risk-averse audiences are is really important. But then secondarily, identify them on a one-to-one or household basis in programmatic media is a killer way to kind of find your nearby local traveler. Because again, remember, you're working a little closer to home than you usually do. The second thing that we recommend people do from a data perspective, go to the next slide, is we are one of the things that we're talking to as we talk to lots and lots of different companies from lots of different walks of life. There's two big questions that everybody's asking right now in 2021. If someone had a great year in 2020 because the conditions of the pandemic benefited them, for example, they're asking if they get to retain those customers they've gained. A good example is just off the cuff is dollar stores. Dollar stores benefited from a lot of closer to home shopping, trip consolidation, meaning instead of taking 3 trips, people only want to take 1, and seeking value. So dollar stores got a lot more customers than they normally would have. And one of the things they're nervous about is, hey, are those customers going to go back to the way they used to shop, and am I going to lose them once COVID is over? So that's one concern. If you've had a good year, you want to hold on to those. If you haven't had a good year, your question is kind of the inverse. Do I get all my old customers back that I used to have? Well, to help you do that, what we're trying to find is those customers that aren't doing the things that your business relies on. So we find devices and households that used to travel a lot. I'm a good example. I used to do business travel 4 times a month, and that dropped to 0 in the middle of March. Now we have all these miles saved up. My family is feeling cabin fever, and the numbers are dropping. We're starting to think about how we get the hell out of our house soon. You're going to want to talk to people like us, which is they used to travel a lot, And now they're starting to think about traveling a lot as we start to see cases dropping, as we start to see vaccination rates pick up. We're going to see people starting to plan the things they used to do that they love that they haven't done for a while. So we can find devices who used to travel a lot, used to go out to fancy restaurants a lot, used to go to destination retail a lot, and then help you talk to them so you can kind of be the top tier on their rate card, or sorry, dance card. And this can be rather impactful and a great way to reconnect with audiences that you haven't spoken to for nearly a year because of extenuating circumstances. So with that, I'd like to thank you guys and thank Jessica and crew for hosting me and open the floor to any questions you might have. And welcome everybody off the mute and camera. There's Grant. Thank you, Grant.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
Super interesting stuff. Thank you, Drew, and thank you, Jessica, as well. Very insightful, a lot of great insights that you both provided. So thank you very much. You covered a lot. So, and we've got about 9 minutes left here. So why don't we just quickly jump into the Q&A, and we'll do our best to answer all of the questions that you have. Again, while we're answering these questions on the chat box on the right, you may ask any additional questions that have popped up into your mind. Okay, so on to the first question here. Do you think the summer of 2021 will have a similar uptick in travel that 2020 had? And I know, Jessica, you had touched on this a bit, and Drew, you've also kind of given some, what are we doing moving forward? So Jessica, do you want to kick that off?
Sure, thanks, Grant. So I think what we saw in 2020 was more of an uptick that was result of the travel industry just basically all taking that pause. There was an extreme drop, almost 90% of the volume that we saw in both of our verticals, hotel and flight. So it was really going from nobody, and that was what drove the seemingly steep incline for summer travel. That said, I do think that as in the U.S. we get vaccinations. Most people are predicted to be vaccinated, I think, by the end of the summer. We're kind of hoping that be the case, that once we are in and we're all feeling safer and it is safer to travel, that we will see more summer travel probably later in the year for the U.S. Drew, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would expect a lot of similar planning where there's going to be huge pent-up desire for travel. There's so much cabin fever these days, and so anything you can do to capitalize on that discussion and help people look forward to something optimistic, even if it's very far away, is an opportunity that you don't usually get. So I would definitely capitalize on the fact that the demand exists, even though the practical demand isn't quite there yet. Those rollouts are good. Efficacy is good as well. We sit here in the Bay Area. I actually saw one of the most optimistic charts that I've seen. Actually, the county of Marin just issued a PR alert that I Google Marin nursing home vaccination success. There's a chart that basically shows you how many cases they were having a day in care homes, and it was like over 10 a day. And you can see when first vaccination, nothing really happens. Second vaccination, cases drop to zero. And they stay there for over many weeks. And we're going to start to see more data of that because the care homes were the first to be vaccinated at 2 rates. They're largely self-contained. As we start to see more optimistic news, I would definitely be capitalizing on that and helping people, kind of give them the tools to plan in a way that you might not, because that is a vicarious way of how people can recreate and plan. I would be engaging my customers that way.
That's good news. I live in Marin and I have cabin fever, and I've done a lot. I'm guilty of doing a lot of camping and going to beaches. So I'm looking forward.
I'll send you that chart when this is over, Grant. It's the best thing I've seen in a while.
Super. Okay, so now let's talk about the international markets, which, and I think I'd seen in Jessica, in some of your presentation, you talked about international markets. What do you see returning sooner for U.S. travel, in which will lag?
Yeah, what we're seeing so far is Mexico and some other Central and South American countries really being showing the most international recovery so far. So if that continues, I would expect obviously that region to be the first to come back to full level volumes. I would expect next would be Western Europe once they're out of lockdown. They'll be looking for, I think Drew mentioned the psychology of coming out of a small bubble. You're going to still be looking for things that are a bit more familiar. American culture, very familiar to Western culture. We're going to see those travelers next. But where I think there might be a lag is, you know, the in APAC, the Southeast and East Asian countries that have historically had a lot of travel to the US, I think might be a bit slower to come back. There's some backlash, specifically in the US, targeted toward Asians that might discourage travelers. And the other thing happening in APAC is much stricter quarantines. So it's more of a detriment that when you go back, you have to do this really tough strict lockdown before you can freely move. So all of those things kind of hinder a vacation to the US for a while, I think.
Great. The next question we have actually is more of a, I think the start of it's more of a question oriented for you, Drew. So will the drive market expand to further distances, and will the air remain depressed? Or will long haul continue to stay low until air travel increases?
Long haul, it's continued to stay low till, yeah, I mean, I think, look, the multi-day drive thing, like I would expect it to increase a little bit. You know, though there are caps on that behavior that, you know, are independent of COVID. You know, how long someone's willing to stay in a car, you know, how much time you can kind of shuffle off of work or kind of make it accessible. Me just putting my finger in the air is I would expect to see similar distance traveled, you know, maybe 8 to you know 2 days away, or sorry, 1 to 2 days away travel wise. I would expect that to stay relatively flat, because it's just areas that people haven't really started exploring yet and are starting to discover. There's a lot to discover within those regions. I would expect flight to really be the key to reopening, you know, cross-country travel and other types of destinations. And to be clear, I actually expect flight to start to pick back up. That's my own expectation, and it's starting to see a little of it in the data, but nothing that like I would, you know, advise you to wager a bet on quite yet. But it's looking good. So
Still, sorry, Jessica, still critical. I think air is critical to the overall.
It is, and I think the fact that they have good data. There hasn't been, you know, a ton of spread. It's actually pretty safe. They've got good precautions. I think, you know, it is one of those things where it's like that is behavior I think will change pretty quickly due to the vaccine, which is it's regarded as pretty safe behavior, but it still is kind of a risk that people see kind of emotionally. So if you get vaccinated, it's like, great, still going to take the precautions, I'll be fine, and you're going to start to see that pick up. So I would imagine you're going to start to see a bump in tourism for air travel once you start to hit like, you know, the magic number of like 30% of 2 vaccines in the US. That's going to be a lot more vaccine driven than really any other behavior I would expect.
And to tag on to what Drew has said, the other indicator we're looking at is distance, right? If you're still in that 0 to 100 mile, you're not going to fly. There's no reason to, right? You can just hop in a car in an hour, you're there. But when that radius starts to expand, I mean, for me, it's in that 5 to 6 hour range where it makes sense to maybe hop on a plane as opposed to fly. For everyone, it's going to be slightly different. But I think that's when we're going to start to see air resurge, like Drew was mentioning. Although I think we should also remember that there's a segment of the population that now that they're working from home, from anywhere, I would say working from anywhere, that they're hopping in their cars, they're renting RVs, they're taking off, they're exploring the US, that behavior might continue for at least a while. And I wouldn't even begin to guess for how long or if that is going to start new trends. But just to be aware that there's a portion of the population that's doing that activity kind of for the first time during COVID.
Yeah, it's impossible to rent an RV right now. It's amazing.
I was going to say that would explain why my town is filled with sprinters right now.
Yep.
Well,
and try
we are
buying
at,
a Sprinter. It's many months.
yeah, we're at time. I want to thank both of the presenters, Drew and Jessica. Amazing insights. Thank you very much. I want to thank everybody for everybody who joined us here. We will send this presentation out afterwards in the form of an email. And I want to remind everybody to stay positive, stay healthy, of course, stay warm, and please stay in touch. We are all in this together, and we will continue to share our insights to help you with strategy and execution of your marketing to captivate your customers. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.